Bonjour à toutes et à tous. My name is Diane Sachs. I have the honor of being the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario. I am an independent, non-partisan officer of the Ontario Legislature, and I am appointed by all MPPs. I'm the guardian of the Environmental Bill of Rights, and I'm required to report to the Legislature each year on energy, on environment, and on climate without fear or favor. This is my third report to the Ontario Legislature on the environment and on the province's compliance with and Ontarians' use of their environmental rights. This is a 4-volume report. It covers, it's called Back to Basics, and it covers the fiscal year April 1st, 2017 to March 31st, 2018. Volume 1 is about the Environmental Bill of Rights. The environment is too important, too easily damaged, and too easily overlooked to be left entirely to government. The Environmental Bill of Rights gives Ontarians the right to participate in government decisions that significantly affect the environment. Today, I report on more reasons why Ontarians should not blindly assume that the province is doing a good job protecting the environment. But there was some progress worth celebrating. For example, in 2017-2018, it was good to see so many Ontarians using their environmental rights and government taking its obligations under the bill more seriously. As I crisscross Ontario meeting with thousands of Ontarians, they tell me how much they value the bill and the work that our office does, and that we give them tools and information that they need and cannot get anywhere else. One clear win this year was the government getting started on long overdue improvements to the Environmental Registry, the tool that Ontarians use most to exercise their environmental rights. These improvements should make it easier for Ontarians to know about, to understand, and to comment on government proposals on significant environmental issues. So, how is Ontario's environment doing? Water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife, these are some of the basics that we talk about when we say the environment. We know about them, we care about them. Is the government doing a good job looking after them? Well, unfortunately, Ontario leaves troubling gaps in its protections for these valuable natural resources, and these gaps do a lot of damage. The good news is that small changes in government action could have real impacts. My recommendations detail smart, sensible solutions, many of which cost relatively little, which could yield big rewards. Volume 2 is about water. In the 18 years since the Walkerton contaminated drinking water tragedy, much has been done to make drinking water sources safer for about 82% of Ontarians. Hard-working source protection committees have identified hundreds of significant pollution threats to municipal drinking water sources. Conservation authorities and municipalities have taken thousands of actions to manage those risks. But committees have not been given the tools they need to regulate some important threats, such as some fuel tanks, some manure spreading, and contaminated sites. And uncertainty about funding after March 31st leaves the entire critical program up in the air. Through the Walkerton tragedy, surely we have learned how important it is to be vigilant about protecting sources of drinking water. This is no time for the government to turn its back on source water protection. The source protection framework does not, however, protect most Ontario lakes, rivers, and groundwater, including the drinking water sources of Ontarians with private wells or in most northern and Indigenous communities. Instead, the government still allows an astonishing amount of pollution to flow into our lakes and rivers. Raw municipal sewage, agricultural runoff, toxic industrial waste, and road salt are 4 large, significant sources of pollutants that threaten Ontario's waters. And all 4 are things that the Ontario government has known about for decades, but has consistently chosen not to regulate them effectively. First, sewage. In heavy rain, there are 44 Ontario municipalities that still overflow their combined sewers and spill filthy, bacteria-laden sewage directly into lakes and rivers, 766 times last year alone, from Toronto to Moonbeam. And if you want to see the list, it's on page 65 of the Water chapter. Despite closed beaches and decades of concern, the government has still not required these municipalities to do everything reasonable to stop their overflows. For example, we know that municipalities could do more with stormwater fees, wetlands, green infrastructure to keep stormwater from flooding combined sewers. Second, the government does not do enough to stop agricultural runoff into fresh water, a major contributor to toxic algae. Some of it comes from the practice of spreading manure and fertilizer on snow and frozen ground. Quebec and Manitoba have banned the practice because it's harmful. It's completely ineffective in growing crops, and it contributes to excessive runoff and water pollution. It's a needless waste. Why is Ontario still sitting on our hands? Third, despite promising to virtually eliminate persistent toxics and water pollution, the government still allows industries to dump large amounts of 58 toxic wastes directly into lakes and rivers, including lead, arsenic, and ethylene glycol. The province does essentially nothing to stop industries from dumping toxics into municipal sewers, which then flow through the sewage plants and into surface water. And even for the small number of industries that the province does regulate, the limits were set 25 years ago, based on studies from the 1980s, to suit then available technology. Government promises to keep the limits up to date have never been kept. And fourth, the government continues to allow road salt to poison lakes and rivers, even though much of it is used without improving public safety. It's unbelievable that in 2018 the government allows this much filth into our lakes and rivers every year. These are the places Ontarians spend time with our families, where we swim, where we fish. These are the shorelines and the waters that are home to our biodiversity and to us. You may remember Josephine Mandamin, the Anishinaabe grandmother who walked all around the Great Lakes, 10,900 kilometers, carrying a bucket of water to remind us all that water is precious. Polluting our waters is neither inevitable nor necessary. Ontarians should not keep tolerating the government failures that allow so much pollution of our water. Volume 3 is about wetlands and woodlands, and this is another part of the problem. We are losing our wetlands and woodlands. They are critically important to absorb pollution, to buffer flooding, and to provide wildlife habitat. Already, most of southern Ontario has too few of them for healthy ecosystems. We need every one of the wetlands and woodlands that we have left, and we will need them even more as population grows and as climate change becomes more severe. Southern Ontario was once 25% wetlands. Today it's less than 7%. In just 10 years, from 2000 to 2010, Southern Ontario lost close to 15,000 acres of wetlands. And yet, despite years of promises, the government continues to allow the loss of the wetlands and woodlands we have left, and even subsidizes the destruction of wetlands with public money. This is not an accident. An Ontario wetland receives little or no protection until the government has gotten around to officially identifying it as provincially significant. The evaluation process is slow, it's inefficient, and it has a 260-year backlog, creating uncertainty for farmers and developers and meaning constant wetland loss. Instead, all remaining wetlands should be protected, that is, presumed significant, until proven otherwise, and then the protection should be real. Healthy trees and forests are equally important for healthy communities. They filter our air, absorb stormwater, moderate temperatures, and protect against drought. They're habitat for wildlife, and they absorb the carbon emissions that cause climate change. Southern Ontario was once covered with woodlands, but now most of Southern Ontario is below the 30% minimum forest cover needed to keep our ecosystems that sustain us just barely functioning. About half of Southern Ontario has less than 25% wetlands, and some parts have much less. The loss of wetlands and woodlands is particularly extreme in southwestern Ontario. Essex County, for example, has just 3% forest cover and just 1.5% wetlands to hold back heavy rains. So flooding in Windsor should come as no surprise. Next to them is the St. Clair Conservation Watershed. They have only 10% forest and only 0.1% of wetlands left. Without these important buffers, farmers are losing soil and nutrients to erosion, and this washes more phosphorus into the river, feeding the algae growth in Lake Erie. Land in southern Ontario has been under extreme pressure from development and agriculture for some time, and property owners, under current rules, have little economic incentive to preserve these vital natural spaces. Provincial policies for protecting woodlands and wetlands are simply not up to the job. But there are sensible solutions that can provide what's needed. Farmers and other landowners, they're more likely to choose conservation when it makes financial sense. And property owners who commit to protecting them should not be overburdened by paperwork. We all benefit from wetlands and woodlands, so it's not fair to leave the property owners with all the costs. The government should encourage property owners to protect these areas by increasing tax relief and reducing red tape. Volume 4 is about wildlife and wilderness. Diseases can decimate wildlife, and Ontario is already seeing threats we can't ignore. For example, 4 of Ontario's 8 native bat species face extinction from white nose syndrome, costing agriculture billions. And deer suffering chronic wasting disease similar to mad cow are now on our doorstep. They're basically all around us in the 5 states to the south, they're found in the west, and they're now just across the border in Quebec. Wildlife disease can also impact human health. Over 60% of existing human diseases have animal origins, and at least 75% of emerging diseases, including avian flu, swine flu, SARS, rabies, Lyme disease, to name a few. These diseases can have severe economic impacts, and it will take a high level of vigilance to keep them at bay. Ontario does collect a lot of data about biodiversity, but we need to connect the dots. Ontario needs to see the big picture so that conservation work can be effective. Instead, information is not shared well and coordination is lacking. And meanwhile, Ontario shows too little respect and too little support for the wildlife and wilderness conservation work that's done by dedicated volunteers and nonprofit organizations such as the Ontario Biodiversity Council. The government leans heavily on their valuable work to justify underfunding its own, but it hasn't reciprocated with the modest long-term funding commitments that they need. Small but consistent investments in these organizations could be highly cost-effective and yield big returns. In conclusion, the failures described in this report, they're not inevitable, and they're not necessary. Small changes can better protect Ontario's water, wetlands, woodlands, and wildlife. My report offers sensible solutions. Many cost relatively little and would yield big rewards. The Ontario government has the primary responsibility to preserve the natural environment upon which our lives depend. It should do more to protect water. It should commit long-term funding to protect the Source Protection Program. It should require municipalities to do everything reasonable to stop overflowing raw sewage into lakes and rivers. It should review the outdated industrial toxic waste standards and limit pollution from agricultural runoff and road salt. Our wetlands and woodlands are too valuable and now too scarce to keep losing. They need strong, immediate legal protection, and we should encourage farmers and property owners to protect them with less red tape and more tax relief. And government must be vigilant in monitoring our biodiversity, connect the dots, and provide stable support for the invaluable Ontario Biodiversity Council. Honoring Ontarians' environmental rights can help make a real difference. Ontarians have the right and the tools to protect our environment. We are lucky to live in this beautiful province. If we want it to stay this way, we have to look after it. Thank you. Any questions?
To water, the 82%, is that a huge improvement? And what about the other 18%? I mean, is that like 1 in 5 don't have access to safe drinking water?
So 1 in 5 don't have their drinking water protected under the Clean Water Act. So 3% of those are in northern and indigenous communities, and I reported last year the terrible situation facing indigenous communities in terms of drinking water. And even today, there are still 26 indigenous communities that have long-term do not consume or boil water advisories on their water, if they have piped water at all to their homes. So they have a continuing serious problem. For the 15% of Ontarians who use private wells, as I used to do when I lived in the country, Clean Water Act doesn't help them at all. And they're on their own for dealing with septic tanks. And for example, we know that most septic tanks go uninspected for decades. They're on their own dealing with manure spreading, and we know that the majority of manure spreading in Ontario isn't regulated by the province. They're on their own dealing with fuel tank leaks, and we know that fuel tanks are very common and spill frequently. So they're on their own. For the 82% of us who get municipal drinking water, except in the far north, yes, our water is better. Just the fact that the Source Protection Committees found hundreds of significant drinking water threats that were direct risks to municipal drinking water sources tells us that we were really lucky up until Walkerton that nothing like that had happened. And so right now, we're better protected. 99.8% of municipal treated drinking water samples met provincial criteria last year. But I can't count on that continuing to be that way if the province ends its funding for source water protection March 31st, which appears to be what they're now planning.
I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the cost to upgrade these combined sewer systems that you've identified as a real problem when it comes to overflows. You say that there are some issues that municipalities could tackle which wouldn't cost a lot of money, which could make a big difference.
Right. So upgrading the systems is very expensive, and this is one of the reasons why there has been, in some places, comparatively little progress. But what we point out in the water chapter is there's a lot of ways to stop combined sewer overflows. The first thing is how much is there in there? So there's two types of water that go, or fluids that go into these combined sewers. One is sanitary sewage from houses. So do we have good water conservation programs to reduce the amount of sewage that there is? And the answer is in a lot of places we've got huge opportunities for more conservation. We don't do it. The second thing is, can we reduce the amount of stormwater or groundwater that goes into these sewers? So in terms of groundwater infiltration, is there a good enough leak protection system so groundwater doesn't flood in? A lot of them don't. Do we have good enough programs to keep stormwater out of the combined sewers? We don't. Very few Ontario municipalities have, for example, stormwater fees, which give property owners a financial incentive to keep the stormwater on their property instead of dumping it into the sewer. Toronto doesn't have one, for example, and we're the only municipality that has 3 different combined sewer systems. A quarter of Toronto is still on combined sewers. And we know that we could do a lot more to keep stormwater out with green infrastructure, with wetlands, with really well-enforced downspout connection programs. So in addition to spending a lot of money on concrete, which is very expensive, there's lots of things that can be done in terms of operations. And I haven't seen, so the law says that it's illegal to dump filth into our water. A municipality can be excused if they have used due diligence, which means using all reasonable measures. And I don't know any municipality that is taking all available measures to prevent these combined sewer overflows. And the government just keeps turning a blind eye. Even the city of Timmins, and we document that in the report, they've been so bad that the ministry finally issued them an order. They didn't comply with the order. The ministry still didn't do anything.
If the government then were to, I guess, get tough with these municipalities, would then not also have to effectively start writing checks to help upgrade these sewer systems?
Well, that's the point, right? That's been the excuse that the province has used for years, is we don't want to give them money, so we're going to turn a blind eye to the consequences. My point is that money is only a piece of it. Full cost recovery for stormwater systems is already part of it. Why are we allowing somebody with a large parking lot to dump all of that stormwater directly into the sewer, overflowing into the river or the lake that we all suffer, and they don't pay anything? There are lots of things that municipalities can do. It doesn't have to be the way it is.
I'm sorry, can you just clarify if the water isn't going, like in the water in that parking lot?
Where does it go?
Yeah.
It should be kept on site. So the whole point about green infrastructure, low impact development, is if you have basically swales. You've got trees on the parking lot, you've got swales, so the water should sink back into the groundwater where it always would have gone before it was paved. This idea that stormwater is a public problem to be paid for entirely at public expense and handled entirely on public money, on public land, it cannot work. And it specifically cannot work as climate change makes the intensity of storms stronger. So it's an old idea. It doesn't work. It's never worked well. It's not working now. We don't have to keep doing it.
And just a question about road salt.
Yes.
Are you calling for an all-time ban on road salt across Ontario?
Oh, no,
or-
certainly not. I mean, I wish I could. But the first thing is that a lot of road salt is wasted. So there have been a number of studies to show that at least a quarter of the road salt that's used, particularly on private properties for parking lots, driveways, and so on, is wasted. They put on more than is necessary. They put it on when it doesn't do any good because of the temperature. They put on much too much because they're worried about liability. And so one of the U.S. states, I think it was New Hampshire, for example, has a law that anybody that is putting salt on private property, I mean, other than what you do on your own driveway, has to be certified, that they have been trained to learn how to use salt. And if they are certified and they follow the rules, then they aren't liable if somebody slips and falls. So that's the other reason why people put on much too much salt, is they think, well, so what if somebody slips and they sue me? So they double the use of salt, which is fine for them. It's the usual problem. The public suffers, the watercourses suffer. We have so many of our creeks now that are so full of salt that all year round that really very little can live there. And so we need to recognize that the pollution has a consequence and strike a better balance. And
The salt in Ontario is not certified? I mean,
we don't have anything like that. I mean, Waterloo has a program because their drinking water is being affected by the salt, particularly on private property. We've also got some real leadership coming from the Ministry of Transportation, where they've been able to significantly reduce their use of salt, and more to the point, keep a lot of the salt where they put it. But putting salt on the road and having it wash off right away doesn't do any good. There's also a big question as to what you do with the snow that's contaminated with salt. Where do you put it? Can you put it in a more sensitive place or a less sensitive place? So the Ministry of Transportation has led the way. Some municipalities are following, many are not. Some municipalities still don't even put a cover on their salt piles. And then we have this huge problem with the private properties. So we need to use salt. I mean, we should have more investment in alternatives, for sure, because the economic consequences are huge. But wasting it when it doesn't even produce public safety, this is nuts.
You mentioned your concern about the source protection program.
Yes.
And funding beyond March 31st, 2019. Why does that program matter?
Well, we have to get water from somewhere. I mean, if you think about the basic necessities of life, water is pretty much at the top after air. And we have, with this extraordinary richness of fresh water, it's easy to pollute it. It's very hard to clean it. And what we know is that most of the pollutants that we're allowing to go into the water, and salt and phosphorus are both good examples, once they're in, they're there for a long time. They're very, very hard to get out. The more we pollute the water, I mean, not only do we lose the biodiversity, it becomes harder and harder to find water we can drink. We have more and more places in Ontario where the municipal water is unsafe for people with a heart condition because there's too much sodium in it. You look at Waterloo is starting to have that challenge. Ramsey Lake in Sudbury is having that challenge. And they keep building more parking lots around. They're getting more salt in the lake. They already have sodium levels that are of concern. So if we pollute our water, what are we going to drink? Not to mention, what do we want to share the province with?
You mentioned in your report that Metrolinx doesn't have to currently comply with, I think, the EBR, the environmental registry.
Yes.
What effect does that have? Why is it important? You ask that Metrolinx should be made to comply with the EBR. Why does that matter?
So the Environmental Bill of Rights, as I mentioned at the beginning, gives Ontarians the right to participate in significant environmental decisions. And we're coming up to the 25th anniversary of the bill, and yet, as we documented in this year's report and last year, there's a lot of gaps. And so that means that those organizations don't have to give public notice. They don't have to consult the public. The public gets no say. And what we learned really between the McCrew report in 1968 and when the bill was passed in 1992 is environment is too important to be left just to government. We honestly can't blindly trust them to always do the right thing. And so having a public voice is important. And we know the public values that voice. As we documented last year, there were 24,000 public comments on the 10 highest, most popular postings. And then you look this fall, there were 11,000 comments on Bill 4. People want to have their say. And what we've learned is people often have something very useful to say that the government doesn't know or isn't doing. So if they're not covered by the bill, there's no public posting, there's no ability to comment, there's no obligation to consider those comments. The government just gets to do things behind closed doors, and sometimes they do it right, and sometimes they do it wrong.
Does it matter more today, given the prominence that Metrolinx and transit spending have played, than it would have, say, 10 or 15 years ago?
I think it was always important, but Metrolinx is having a larger and larger impact on people's lives, and also as we're still planning to increase the population of Southern Ontario another 50% in the next 25 years. So that means more people, more development, more impacts on the natural world. We're already pushing the natural world to its edge in many parts of Ontario. How bad do we want it to be?
You've identified some big files here, including, the 260-year backlog on wetlands, water protection, and everything else. What do you expect from the new government? What are the challenges they face in addressing these causes?
Well, every government always has more demands for time and money than they have. But as I tried to emphasize in my talk, most of these problems have fairly simple solutions. This idea that a wetland gets no protection until the government gets around to a very, very elaborate process that they're 260 years behind, this is just bad design. We shouldn't destroy any more wetlands. So that doesn't cost anything. That just means we need a clear rule. We need these wetlands. And, I expect to see that having more and more prominence in insurance rates, because the flood losses are now the dominant driver of insurance losses in Ontario. We had $1.2 billion in catastrophic weather events insured losses in just the first 9 months of this year. And we expect that their uninsured financial losses that families and businesses would have would be at least as large as that, maybe 3 times as large as that. So the consequences are starting to bite people. And I think people will care. We know that most families can't pay for a flood in their home if they don't have insurance. And more people don't have insurance or can't afford insurance or won't be able to get insurance. So these are things that don't require a moonshot, right? These are fairly easy fixes. Bring the, look at the technology changes that have happened since the 1980s. Why are we still relying on technology standards that were set in the 1980s? These are not very hard things to do. That's why I call this report Back to Basics. I know a new government's got a lot of things to do, a lot of objectives they want to do. These shouldn't be hard.
Can you speak to any improvements that you've seen in any of the 4 areas over the last few years?
Well, you mean other than the EBR itself? There certainly are. There's wonderful work being done, as I said, by the Ontario Biodiversity Council on a shoestring. They get $10,000 of money from the province a year with absolutely no promise that they're going to get it the next year. And even so, they have been able to really do astounding work. 40% of the nature observations that the Ministry of Natural Resources receives are from dedicated volunteers. We've got this new app called iNaturalist. I don't know if you've looked at it, that you can have on your smartphone. And if you see an interesting critter, you can take a picture, put in this whatever you know, and send it in, and experts can look at it. And that's allowing species that haven't been identified before to be seen. I do think a lot can be done with citizen science if we provide a little bit of respect and support.
It's a lot of ground up stuff you're talking about.
There's a lot of great ground up stuff that's being done, for sure. And also there are a lot of really dedicated people in the government, don't get me wrong. There's people who devote their lives to this. We just need to make it easier for them to do the right thing in the right way. And that having the rules set up to make that possible, that's the government's job. And what I pointed out here is there's a lot of areas where the government is not doing that job. And so people are struggling, doing their best, but it's not good enough, and it's not good enough because the rules are wrong. Anybody else? Well, yes?
One of the government's big files going forward is, they've talked a lot about, opening up more land for housing development to try and bring housing prices in the Greater Golden Horseshoe down. I mean, outside of today's news, have you heard anything so far that gives you any kind of concerns about potential risks to environmental protections there?
Well, absolutely. Whenever the government says they're going to open up more land for development, then we know what that usually means. That usually means paving natural areas. That usually means destroying natural areas. That usually means condemning people to very, very long commutes, dependence on high fossil fuel consumption, when we know that climate change is the greatest risk facing Ontario and the world. We know that Ontario is warming much faster than the world average. We know that Toronto alone has warmed 3 times as much as the world's average. And so climate change matters here. And the more the government does to lock people into a high fossil fuel lifestyle, the more climate damage we're going to have, and the tougher the transition is going to be once people finally realize we can't do that anymore. Well, thank you all very, very much.